Well, I suppose we'll start then. A very warm welcome from myself and Leanne, with the TMO Forum co-chairs. I'm very excited about this first TMO Large Forum of the year. This is really an opportunity to do what the TMO Forum really exists for, which is connecting the leadership and the executive of our organisation as Callan with our trainee medical officers, which is, we define that as everyone from intern up to fellow level. And within an organisation, it's something up to about 800 staff, so it's a very large body. I've been very excited about this year, the engagement that we've had with Lesley as the CEO, with Jerry as the acting executive DMS, and others from the executive group, in terms of having meaningful dialogue about things that really matter to us, and not just improving patient care, but making Callan a better place for us to work as staff. So I'm really passionate about that, because I actually really love my job and I like working here. And yet there's also so many things that we could work on together to make this a better place. So with no further ado, am I introducing Lesley, or were you? I'm doing that, thank you. Just really appreciate the partnership from my co-chair as well. So I'd like to introduce Lesley Dwyer, who's our CEO as of late last year. Our first interactions was, I read Lesley's Friday afternoon email where she was talking about her Gemba walks, I can't remember the pronunciation, and saying that she wanted to go to a night shift. So I thought, I'm on night shift at Queen Elizabeth and it's 9 o'clock. I'm just going to email the CEO, because what have I got to lose? And I said, do you want to come on a night shift? I think we do some good work here at Queen Elizabeth after 9 p.m. Not that we don't do good work before 9 a.m, I hasten to add. And she said, yep, I'll be there on Tuesday, basically. And then she and Don Mackey, the Executive Director of Medical Services at the time, both came, and from 8:30 till midnight, followed myself and Josh Inglis as my resident around as we went to Code Blues, we went to intensive care, we saw some people on the ward, we admitted some patients in ED, we ended up palliating 2 patients as well, and it was really kind of a bit of a spectrum of what we do on nights, and since then we've had some really good dialogues about meaningful things we do in the hospital. So thank you, Lesley.
So I've got that there. Okay. Now, as many of you know, I have discovered this new device, and there I go. Where has this been all my life? The person following me will have to do something about that, though. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Leanne. I've been asked to talk a bit about, some of the changes that we are striving towards around organisational culture and culture change. I get just a couple of minutes longer, so I am going to steal that time if that's okay. So, oops, what have I done here? Try again. This I learnt yesterday is called a word cloud. Yes, I'm that old that I had to ask somebody. I said, I know what I want to look like, but I don't know what it is. And I've been really interested in culture, not just before I got here, but in fact that normally when you go to any organisation, one of the first things you want to know is how do they do things here, which is often just a, code for, what's the culture here. And yet I have probably interviewed more people than perhaps anybody else in this room for jobs, and nobody has ever asked me about the culture. And yet it's always a question I ask if I'm being interviewed, is just tell me a little bit, because what you're looking for is organisational fit. But we've had lots of people say what do they think culture is, and there's a whole series of words up there. And in particular, what I wanted to actually bring was the values, because often the values or the philosophy of an organisation and the way that we describe behaviours that would uphold those values is really what we're talking about in the culture. But I also want to put this in the context that we've been called out for not having a very good culture here at Callan. That was called out in the diagnostics, but it was actually called out before that, and it's often called out in staff surveys. We have something like 38% of our staff who, according to the last SA Health Survey, and I'm sorry I can't remember the name of it, I work for SA, am I close? Anyway, that's what I'm going to call it for tonight, said that over the next 2 years they'd like to leave Callan. Now, they could be retiring, they could be going on to the next big thing, but that's a pretty large percentage. And we hear people talk about a culture of bullying, a culture of, not speaking up, of, perhaps being asked to do things that you wouldn't want to do around the way of work practices. And they're things that we really have to say we don't want to be that sort of organisation, because there's a direct link between culture and patient outcomes, and I'll come back to that in a tick. But there's all sorts of things up there, you know, sort of speaking up, clarity, change, resilient, a whole different range of different things. But really what this is about is what you want is an engaged culture. You need to have everybody step forward and meet about the things that really matter to an organisation, because it's the only thing that not only keeps our patients safe, but it keeps all of us safe too. As many of you know, I came back here at the end of November, and I'd worked for almost 4 years in the NHS. And I think that from a cultural perspective, the NHS had put lots of things in place to try and fix a culture. But of course, we all know the reason that a lot of that work happened, and often, you know, sort of out of what I'll call famous failures, things change. So I think, even though I'm looking at very young people in the audience, but in fact a lot of what you see, particularly in the quality and safety, the clinical audit, came out of mid-staffs. So mid-staffs had a famous failure, and they said that that was because they were going through a financial recovery at the time, and they took their eye off the ball. I'd read about that from a distance. I went through a cycle of every 2 years doing a review of the organisations I was in against the recommendations from mid-staffs. Following that in the UK, many trusts went into quality special measures, which meant that the quality of care was not where it needed to be. I went to the UK to be the chief executive of one of those. It went into quality special measures and could never get out. I'm hoping that many of you know about the HSMR, so the standardised mortality rate. You know, sticking around the middle of the pack, you know, wanting to be about 100 or less is good. Guy's and St Thomas's, by way of example, is about 87%. Always wondered how they quite did that. But in fact, Medway was at 124 and rising, and everybody thought that was okay. And it wasn't. So often what happens when you don't have a great culture is you've normalised things. So mid-staffs really set, I think, the benchmark and the focus on why culture is really important. Throughout the mid-staffs report and the follow-up report from both Bruce Keogh, so you'll often hear reference to him, and also he heads up the quality area within the NHS, but also Don Berwick from IHI. They talked about the culture of mid-staffs where people were afraid to actually raise their hand and to be that person that stepped forward. But they're not alone. Oops, sorry, go back. I guess I did press the other one. You can see all of the others that are here too. So Southern Health, by the way, is in the UK. I thought I'd better apologise to my Monash Health friends because they were called Southern Health. Again, it's a mental health trust and a community trust, and a absolute spectacular failure of clinical governance where young people died in their care. Bundaberg here in Queensland, I think after Bundaberg they perfected the fly-in, fly-out of getting better clinical support, particularly into the regional areas of Queensland. But lots of lessons learned. The Royal Bristol, again, paediatric, sort of cardiac surgery, and the Royal Melbourne, so closer to home. The Royal Melbourne had an absolute failure of governance where patients died under the care and nobody reported it. And I happened to be at the Royal Melbourne at the time, and it's the first time ever I've received a letter that's been cut out of like those magazines. It was like being in a movie where you get something presented that way, because staff didn't feel safe to step forward other than doing that anonymously. King Edward is over in Perth. Gosport. Anybody know about Gosport? Yay, well done you. So it is a care home in the UK, and they had a number of over 200 deaths over a protracted period, which came down to the care provided particularly by one practitioner. And again, people knew that patients were dying that didn't need to, but didn't step out. In their report, you only get to, I think, about page 8, and failure of culture and of leadership is mentioned 21 times. And I've had to include ourselves here too. Over the last few years we've had a chemotherapy issue, but also here at Carlin we've been called out about our culture. So it's really, really important that we do something about it. So this isn't my favourite picture or my favourite saying, and I feel myself always bristle when people say this, which is, the fish always rots from the head down, which means that I am starting the rot or I am stopping the rot. And the reason I say I bristle at this, it's a bit like when someone says to me, what are you doing about morale? And if you ever ask me that, I'll try and be polite, but normally I say, well, what the hell are you doing? Because in fact, this is about all of us. We are leaders at all levels in this organisation, but this one actually is important because unless we set the expectation of behaviour and the tone and we model that, that's why I write every Friday, what we walk past we accept. Because the standard you do walk past is the standard that you have just become. And I think we normalise things here too much. And so this is really important. And that doesn't mean we get it right all of the time, but in fact we need to make sure that we continue just to push each other that when the culture isn't right, and we have to now start to describe our culture, and I'll sort of wrap up with what we're going to do next around that. But I'm always reminded of this one about the fish always rotting from the head, because people will not stay if they don't like the culture. And we don't have a very high attrition rate, which I'm not too sure that I think it's a good thing. And the reason I don't think it's a good thing is we've called out a culture that needs to improve. Now that doesn't mean we all see pockets of excellence, because I see them all the time and that's what keeps you going. But in fact, isn't it awful if you feel you don't have an option, but other than just to stay here, in fact, if things aren't working for you? So I looked at some stats because, of course, we are in a bit of a recovery, and I thought, well, so let's talk about this a little bit. Each time I lose a nurse, I probably have to pay about another 50K by the time you onboard somebody, train them up, etc. If I lose a very skilled consultant, physician, I'm talking over $1 million over the next little while by the time I bring somebody else in, train them up, etc. But in fact, that we know that if I have 86% of, of our staff who are engaged, they're less likely to actually leave. You start to get almost into that herd mentality, because in fact, when we feel positive and engaged about a culture and the way that we do things here, then that's what in fact other people are attracted to, and they stay. And almost all organisations, whether they're in healthcare, whether they're in big business or what have you, always say that engagement and culture are their top issues. I know that in fact people will say to you that culture takes a long time to turn around. I disagree slightly with that, because unless you right at the beginning say that's enough now, this is how we're going to behave, and set an expectation, things will never change. And once it starts, it's actually really quite, pardon the pun, infectious. People start to believe in it and feel that you've got their backs. It's one of the things that I say to the team that I'm part of, which is I will always have your back, because that's what good teams do. Do many of you know about IHI, so the Institute of Healthcare Improvement, normally associated with BMJ, etc. They talk about the triple aim, and we use that in our recovery: better health, better care, better value, often done by that. I don't know quite how to do that, but it's that, because they've got now a fourth aim, which is called joy in work, and that's really about engagement, and that's where we need to be, and lots of things have been spurned by that. And so just getting almost to the end, I want to talk about the culture that we want. Many of you might know that I've invited Andrew to join Jerry and myself and Katie Gibb on a course with the University of Tennessee at Vanderbilt around their promoting professionalism. And that is very much about how do you manage behaviours. How many of you, because you're all sort of trainees, have come into an organisation, it could be this one, and you've heard, oh, so-and-so, watch out for so-and-so, da-da-da-da-da, you get all the things that you need to be a bit careful with, but he is a good, cutter, whatever. And we've all done that. And there is a direct correlation between behaviour and patient outcomes. And there's some fantastic, you can Google most of this, there's a fantastic article about that patient outcomes following surgery has more impact based on behaviour than what it does around the clinical care. And that's because people won't speak up. How many of you would get on a plane if you didn't think that the co-pilot actually had the authority to say, Captain, I'm taking over the plane, when the captain isn't following the rule book? And so for me, when I think about culture, I really want to actually make sure that we do make our care and our organisation much safer, much more reliable and much kinder. So next week, and I know some of you will attend it, we have our second Leaders Within, and we're going to start talking about our values, not glibly, because I don't actually really know what our values are here, I can never remember them. But in fact, what we have to do is make them real and then describe how we would see those values. Those values then become, and our philosophy of the way we work together and the way that we behave, absolutely link to us being able to create the culture that we want people to come here, we want to have their backs, we want to have a kind culture, we want our patients to have a far better experience than what they have now. And so I like that concept of making medicine safer, and the NHS has an aspiration to be the safest health system in the world. You know, can we say that we are a safe health system? We know that we report and have more adverse events than any other state. We're above the national average. Is it a good reporting culture? It's a question I can't quite answer yet. So there's lots of things we need to do. So at the forum next week, we're going to make a start, because this is time now to say, actually, this is the way we do things here. We've got an ambition. We want to actually start to move at pace. We want to be credible people, but we actually want to have an organisation that we all feel valued in and that we're proud of. And I know Jerry's going to talk a little bit about escalation, because unless people speak up, it's very difficult to do anything about it. And we have a litany of things that we cannot do because it's timed out or that no one would stand forward. And this isn't about actually going at it after people in a punitive way. The whole concept of the cup of coffee is that all of us want to come and do a good job. But I'm sure you've all had the experience so far, I certainly have, where I use a terrible phrase, which is Mother Teresa would turn into a homicidal maniac. You know, that things would just frustrate everybody to that point that you know that at times your behaviour lets you down a little bit. So that is really, really important to me, that from here on in, we start to put some techniques into the organisation, we start to think about what it is we do here, and we start to recruit and give feedback based on the behaviours that we've all signed up to. And those behaviours are rooted in our values. So that was all I really wanted to say about culture, other than this is the most important thing that we can ever do, because I want you to have the best of times here. I also want many of you to go, but I want you to go and tell other people to come, and also to come back, because that's how you create a great organisation. So, you know, sort of, you may, you know, we were talking at the executive today, there's a little bit of a, you know, theme song starting, which is Hotel California, which, you know, you all steal our music, so I know you know it. And which is, you know, you can check out any time you like, but you can never leave. And that's what good organisations are, which is that you continue to feel kind about that organisation and talk about it in a way that it actually really attracts others. But you know, when things go wrong and you escalate, someone says, I've got your back, I'm alongside you, and we're going to put this right. And I need everybody standing forward for that. So who am I handing over to now? We did something quite deliberate at the last place I worked, and I always said that my regret was that we didn't do it early enough, because really you do need to make that stand quite early. And I think that we're at a bit of a tipping point. We've been, you know, I've been here 7 months now, and we've really worked on some foundations, and now we're asking leaders to step forward. But we do need to do something, because this doesn't happen by accident or by somebody like me standing up and saying these nice words to you. We have to determine the sort of organisation it is and then put things in place so that there is some tangible change. And that doesn't mean about throwing everything out. We've got some great things that happen here. I think the way that you're supported with education and training, it can be better, but in fact people are really committed to that. It's in fact why many of our consultants are here, because that's what they like to do. And I think we do some of our research exceptionally well. I'm not too sure that we translate it well. So once we describe the Carlin that we want, it's much easier to do that. As I said, at Medway, we didn't do that for probably 3 years. It took us quite a bit of time to come out of special measures for a little while. We were harming people and harming them at an alarming rate. And so we had to get the place safe. Here, I'm not too sure, because I can't touch or feel the safety in the way that I'd like to. But in fact, what I can see is that it's a culture of standing back and waiting, and you're all waiting to see what we do. I know that. I don't judge, I don't blame. So we need to make sure we do move forward. I like a bit of an impact of when we do things and a bit of a launch, but it is also about very much then holding each other to account. So I'm very happy to be told, hang on there, check your behaviour there too, because occasionally, we all muck up, but what we want to do is be that kind organisation. I do not want to be tied up in investigation after investigation, and some things clearly need to be, but other times a quick conversation, which is why we want to go and learn about what this promoting professionalism does, and we did introduce that at Medway. That was our first step into the culture. And then our next part was to bring in somebody from a different industry, and we brought somebody in from retail who teaches people about customers, because in fact our patients do have choices, and they have choices whether they're going to complain about you, and if they have choices about do they go somewhere else. But what they shouldn't have a choice in is actually being at risk of not having the care that they need to have. Do you know, just from the Vanderbilt work, only 3% of, I'll say, clinicians ever really need to have the cup of coffee conversation. And I don't want to turn it into that each time I say I'd like to have a coffee with you, that people run from me, because it's not that sort of a place. But of that 3%, they get 46% of the patient complaints. And in the US, they get 36% of the malpractice lawsuits. There is a direct correlation between the way we behave and the way we provide care. And so that's why this is important to me. This has to become a safe organisation. It has to become an ambitious organisation. And our culture has to be one where everything is possible, and that we are absolutely wanting to be that exemplar organisation. So for those that come to the Leaders Within next week, we're going to start talking about values, behaviours, and let's start changing our culture. Thank you.
Thanks, Lesley, for starting the conversation on behavioural change, and let's all be part of the change we want to see here in Callan.